Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online presentation, which is all about looking into the future. And I've called this Future Focus, and I'm going to explain to you a process called scenario planning. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but there'll be enough for you to think about what the world's going to look like and what your business and your organization is going to look like when we look at post-pandemic. And one of the reasons I'm running this now is because we actually don't know what's coming up in our future. And so I want to give you some techniques and some strategies so that we can still plan for an uncertain future. One of the biggest mistakes that people make, and mainly leaders make, one of the biggest mistakes that leaders make is when there's uncertainty, the trap they fall into is to make their planning too short term, because they say we can't see too far ahead, so let's only plan for what we can see. And that's a mistake, because our world is always changing and continues to be changing fast. And the businesses and the leaders and the teams who are most successful are the ones who have this long-term plan, even in uncertainty. And the key is that they're flexible and they're willing to change their plans as the world changes around them. So before we get started into that topic, let me tell you my three regular rules of engagement for all my presentations, my online and in-person presentations. So I want to give you things to think about, and I'd like you to think in this 45 minutes that we've got together. If you can avoid and turn off any interruptions and distractions, there'll be a chance for you to think a little bit differently and be a bit playful as well. And rather that you think big now, and then when you finish and the real world hits you again, that you had to scale it back, then do it the other way around, where you think small now, because then it's very hard when everything that else is going on around you to start thinking bigger. But there'll be a chance for you to engage. I've got some poll questions. You can ask me questions. Use the chat room to ask me questions anytime. And I'll stop at various points during the presentation to answer questions as well. But feel free to ask your questions as we go. And then when we stop, I'll answer the questions that have come through. And be a bit playful. The more that you engage in this 45 minutes, the more value you'll get out of it, and the better the actions you'll have at the end, so that you can then go away and put them into practice in your business and for yourself as well. I'm recording this presentation, and if you want to get a copy of the recording later to review it, then you can go to gihantoldme.com, and this is a page where I put this recording for a limited time and some additional resources as well. So if you want some reference material, it'll be there. So you don't frantically have to be taking notes as you go, but of course, feel free to do that. I know many of the people here today in the room, but for those who don't know me, my name's Gihan Pereira. I'm a futurist, which means that I look at trends and I help people prepare for the future. And that's why we're going to do this today. If you want to find out more about me, it's on my website, so I won't go into a lot of detail about me, because this is not about me. This is about you and you planning for the future. This is just some of the organizations that I've worked with in Australia, New Zealand, around the world. And I just want to share this with you because these are organizations that I've worked with at a leadership level, and it's broad. So there's some government, non-government, big companies, small companies, multinationals, and local companies, and they're all facing an uncertain future. So you're probably sick of hearing people say that we're living in unprecedented times, but it's only unprecedented because it's happening to all of us at the same time. And over the last few years, I've worked with a number of organizations, a number of leadership teams in industries that are also going through this massive and rapid change, and they don't know what the future holds. So what's different now is that it's just hit all of us at the same time. But this idea of unprecedented, fast-changing world is not something that's new. It's just suddenly come into sharp focus for all of us. So I run these programs for my clients, for organizations, so in terms of in boardrooms and in workshops. This is not going to be the full version of that presentation. What I want to do today is give you a little cut down version, and rather than try and compress everything into 45 minutes, because then you won't get much value from it, I'll pick and choose little elements of what I present so that you've actually got chunks of stuff that you can actually put into action, rather than me trying to give you an overview and your eyes will glaze over because it's too much. So today I want to talk about three things broadly. So I want to talk about, first of all, the world. So you're looking outside, and how do you scan wider into the outside world. We'll look briefly at customers, because everything that you do should be based on your customers, clients, patients, whatever you call them, members, whatever way that you deal with the outside world, the people that you serve, everything's going to be focused on customers. We won't spend as much time there. And then the last one is, of course, about you and your mindset. So I want to give you a really useful exercise to help you perhaps find some of the gaps in your own thinking and areas that you can work on to be ready for this uncertain future. I saw this photograph of this cinema, the world cinema, and I think it's quite appropriate now, because if you're starting off looking at the world, it feels like our world is temporarily closed. And yet, now's the time that we should be thinking about the future rather than shutting down and going into hibernation. The most important thing that we can be doing is looking after ourselves now. The next most important thing we can be doing is looking at our future. Okay, so let's get going. So I want to run a poll to see who's in the room. So we've got a few of these as we go through the presentation. This is the first one. So what's your main role at work? And I've broadly put this into different categories, 5 categories. So let me start the polling here. If you haven't done an online poll before, very simple, multiple choice question. Just choose one of the options, and it's anonymous as well, by the way. And I have some idea of the people who are in the room today, but we'll see. And I'll share this with you because it's useful for you to know as well who else is in the room. Okay, so I'll wait till about 80% of people have completed the poll, and we're at 79%, 80%. So I'll leave it open for another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you for voting quickly. That was great. Only 30 seconds for that. So let me end the polling and share the results. Okay, so not surprisingly, and I know the sort of people who registered for this, 40% are senior leaders, and about a quarter, 27% business owners. And you've also got some team leaders and team members and some others as well. So especially if you've got a leadership role, I think the first part of this presentation, when we're looking at the world, is going to be the most relevant for you. And for everybody, the last part, the third section about you and your mindset is going to be essential, I think, when we're looking at the future. And if you've got a customer-facing role as well, the middle part will be relevant. Okay, so let's look at this first area here. And the first area is looking outwards. It's looking at the world and it's scanning wider. So the title of this presentation is Scenario Planning, and it's a process that was initiated by Shell in the 1970s. So Shell put a bunch of people in a room, and I say bunch of people, put 3 guys in a room and said, do some research, tell us what the future is going to be like, and then come and inform us. So the senior management said this. So these 3 guys went into a room and they imagined future scenarios. So they said, what happens if there's a war in the Gulf? What will that do to oil prices? What happens if Jimmy Carter is elected president? What will that do to oil prices? What if OPEC puts a dampener on supply? What will that do to oil prices? Then they went back to senior management and said, here are these scenarios, here's how likely each of them are, take it from here. And the senior management said to them, that's great, which of them is going to happen? And they said, no, that's not the way it works. The way it works is any of these scenarios could happen. We've identified the most plausible scenarios, and we've given you some probabilities of what we think is likely and which are less likely. So from that, choose a plan, but also here are some other scenarios. So if they happen, make sure you've got backup plans as well. And this is what we have to do now. And this is what I've been coaching and advising my clients for the last 5 years, is not just to have a really good plan A, but make sure you've got plan B, C, and D, and so on. Okay, and scenario planning in a nutshell is it's 2 steps, so 2 very broad steps. The first step is to say, what could happen? What could happen in the future? And we identify multiple scenarios. And then for them, you say, what? Okay, so we're going to do a very simplified version of this today, but it'll be enough for you to go away and do some basic scenario planning for yourself and your own leadership team. And of course, if you want me to come in and assist you with that and facilitate that, happy to do that. But you'll have enough today to actually get off to a good start. And you don't have to anticipate every scenario. So I'm from beautiful Perth, and we're famous for our black swans, among other things. And there's this concept called a black swan event. And the idea is that Europeans, before they came to Australia, thought all swans were white. And then they came to Australia and they saw black swan for the first time. And it was a completely unpredictable event for them. It's not as if there were almost all swans were white, and then there were a few grey and a few dark grey. There was no trend leading into it. It was a completely unexpected and unpredictable event. And for many of us, this coronavirus has been a black swan event. We couldn't have predicted it. It's not true that nobody predicted it. Bill Gates predicted almost exactly this in a TED Talk 5 years ago, and a number of other futurists have been creating these scenarios where a pandemic could have been one of them. But for most of us, it was a completely black swan event. You don't have to look at black swan events in your scenario planning. What you should be looking at are the more plausible scenarios. Okay? They don't always have to be the most likely ones, but you don't always have to look at the things that are way, way out there, like an asteroid hitting Earth or a global pandemic. Okay, so the first tool that I'm going to show you, in fact, this is the tool that we'll look at broadly, is a tool called PESTLE Analysis. And PESTLE is just an acronym. You may have come across it. Some people call it STEEP analysis because it's S-T-E-E-P. PESTLE just has one extra letter in there. So if anyone says to you, oh, I've come across STEEP analysis, you just go, oh, yeah, I'm talking about PESTLE, which is the next version of that. There's an acronym, and it stands for and it's just an acronym that will help you with your thinking about future scenarios. So it stands for political. So what are the political impacts in the future that could affect us? The next one's environmental. The next one's social or sociological. So there's the people impacts. The next one, which has had a lot of play in the last decade, I think too much, is technological. And technology covers everything. So everyone's thinking about what technology is going to affect it, and they sometimes ignore some of the others. The next one's legal or regulatory. So what sort of things could affect us? What sort of regulations could have an impact on us, and so on. And the last one's economic, which of course is very big for us at the moment. So we're not going to do a full PESTLE analysis here, but I want to show you all of the six sectors in PESTLE so that you can do your own PESTLE analysis. Let's focus on this environmental one, because what's happening to us now, the coronavirus, we call it environmental. By the way, it doesn't matter which category you put things into. So if you decide that it's more of a social and economic impact, that's okay. It doesn't matter. PESTLE is just a way for your brain to think about 6 different things. Okay, so many of us have seen this sort of example, this sort of curve in the last couple of months. And the idea of flattening the curve is bringing the caseload down of the virus to a low enough level that our healthcare system can manage. It doesn't mean the virus is eliminated, but it just means that caseload is low. So it doesn't mean that there's no virus out there. It just means now there's an ICU bed waiting for you if you need it. Okay, so this is what we've done well in Australia. And now we're starting to relax restrictions. We're starting to think about what's our future going to look like. And there are a number of possible scenarios. So let me go through some of them broadly for you. And then you should be applying them to your own business, to your own life, to your own industry. Just a little bit of a warning before we do that. People have their vested interest, and sometimes and it's fun, is even with leadership teams, they're afraid to even examine things that are too threatening. So there's this quotation that I love from Upton Sinclair, an American author. He said, it's difficult to get somebody to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding. Okay, so we have this inbuilt confirmation bias, which says that we like things that confirm our beliefs, and we ignore things that disconfirm our beliefs. So, and part of that is looking after ourselves. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why people get me in, because I bring an external perspective without this vested interest. But just be aware of it, that when you do your PESTLE analysis and when you do your scenario planning, be careful not to completely neglect scenarios that are too difficult for you to imagine. So if you imagine that there's a scenario that's completely going to wipe out your whole industry forever, then that's something to include in your scenario planning, as long as it's not as long as it is a plausible scenario. So this happened with DVD rentals. So companies like Blockbuster, they could never imagine that their whole industry would be wiped out forever. Okay, so they missed things like Netflix, which is an example I'll talk about a bit later. So just be aware of that. So one of the things that I do to keep myself on the right track is that just imagine that. So a lot of my business was speaking at conferences, doing keynote presentations, and you think, well, How could that be affected? And me individually, of course, this happened now with the pandemic, but even before this, I was thinking that there's this robot, Sophia the robot, who is now doing keynote presentations at conferences. So she's kind of this lifelike robot with artificial intelligence built in. There's a bit gimmicky at the moment to have Sophia the robot at your conference, but she's taking keynote spots that I should be getting. So just think that just because Sophia is a threat to my business doesn't mean that I should eliminate her from my scenario planning. Okay, so with that as a bit of a warning, let's do a little bit of scenario planning. So what could happen if we're looking at the impact of the coronavirus and the spread of COVID-19 throughout the world? Here are some possible scenarios. So one of them is that we eradicate the virus globally, so it just disappears altogether. A second option is that we eliminate it locally. So maybe I live in Western Australia, could be eliminated here, and then we keep the hard borders with the rest of the country, could be eliminated all throughout Australia. It could be that we have this trans-Tasman bubble between Australia and New Zealand. It could be that we have this APAC bubble as the Asian countries are managing it better, so we join with them more than we join with the USA and North America and Europe. It could be any of those things, okay? So we could have a number of scenarios there. And the other option, of course, which everyone's looking for, is to find a vaccine, but most vaccines take years to find. We're hoping that we'll find one in 12 to 18 months, but that's the fastest ever for a vaccine, but that's a possibility. Another one is that we don't find a vaccine, but we find a treatment for it. So we say it's not so bad if we contract COVID-19 because there are effective treatments for it. And there are other scenarios, like the virus becomes endemic in our population, which means that it just lives with us, like things like the common cold and the flu, and we just find ways to manage it. So these are possible scenarios in our future. Which of them is going to happen? Well, like senior management at Shell, talking to those consultants, we don't know. We don't know which of these is going to happen. We should be looking at plausible scenarios and then mapping out plans for each of them. Now, you don't have to create a detailed plan for every one of the scenarios. And the 5 that I've listed here are not the only scenario. So if you look at any one of them, you could go into much more depth. So you could say, find a vaccine in the next 12 months, find a vaccine in 2 years, find a vaccine in the next decade. And some of my clients are doing that forward planning to 2030. So they're looking ahead at what's going to happen in the next 10 years. So there are multiple scenarios here. Choose a plausible scenario for now, but be flexible and willing to switch if you need to. Okay, so what do you do with these scenarios? So let's say, and I very much simplified the process here, but if you start off by going through the PESTLE analysis. We've done this with one environmental factor. There are others like climate change, and then you do the same with all the other letters of the word PESTLE. Okay, so you go through that, and this is just kind of like a brainstorming process and a big picture thinking, like what could happen in the future. And then what you ideally do is assign some sort of likelihood to these scenarios. And for that, you bring in outside expertise. Or you do some research yourself. This is actually one of the things that I do when I do scenario planning with clients, is I look at the industry, I look at, in this case, the pandemic, and talk about likely scenarios versus unlikely scenarios. We won't go into that process here, but I reckon you can start with some idea for your business, for your industry, what might be a few likely scenarios. And I suggest you pick 3 of them, and one of them is the one that you're going to go for at the start, and the other 2 are going to be your next backup plans. Now, then you decide what you're going to do. And I'm just going to give you one very simple process. Many of you will have used a process like this if you've done any sort of coaching or being coached. It's a start, stop, continue. So if this scenario happens, or to be ready for this scenario to happen, what do we need to stop doing now? What do we need to keep doing now? Or what do we need to start doing now? Okay, so remember there's 2 parts of this. So one is assuming this scenario is going to happen, what are we going to start, stop, and continue doing? And the second one is to be ready for that scenario. So we're talking about what do we do now, for now, also, assuming that's going to be the future scenario. And the second one is what are we doing now to be ready for that scenario in the future? I hope I explained that. But basically, pick a scenario and then go, what are we going to start, stop, or keep doing. Okay, we're going to stop soon for questions and comments. But before that, I'll just show you in the events industry. I saw one really good example of a professional conference organizer who's done this, or communication comms company, PCO. They've done this really well. So Nectar, who I've worked with before, they've done this great video, which you can find on their website, about looking at what events will look like in the future and multiple scenarios based on what happens if we don't have events. And so if we don't have a vaccine, we have to have physical distancing for a while. What happens if we don't have people coming into the country because we don't have our borders open for international travel, and so on. It's worth looking at this. And they haven't gone through the scenario planning process formally, but it's a really good example of exactly what I'm talking about here in multiple scenarios. Okay, let me just quickly stop and see any questions and comments coming in, just in case you want me to clarify anything in this process so far. Okay, let's continue. Okay, so I want to look at your strategic planning here. So we're still in this first area of looking at the world when you're looking at multiple scenarios. See, on the road to recovery, organizations, and we've all seen this, and many of us will have experienced this ourselves with the pandemic. So what happens first is that people go into crisis mode. So what they do is they just do whatever it takes to get things settled. And the settle doesn't mean back to normal. It just means to get out of panic and crisis. And strategic planning goes out the window. All you've got to do is get stable and steady, and you can at least think straight. And then there's a road to recovery. And that will take some time for many industries. It's going to take a long time to get to recovery. And then we're kind of back to where we were before. And then we move into growth. Now, when do you start thinking about your growth strategy? As I said earlier on, a mistake that people make is they only start thinking about their growth strategy when they've recovered and they're back to where they were before. That's a mistake. You can start doing this planning way before that. You can start thinking about where you're going to be positioned in your market, in the industry, with your existing customers, in terms of growing your customer base. You can start thinking about that well before you get to the point where you're ready to start growing again. You probably won't be doing it at crisis level, but on the road to recovery, the organizations that are going to come out of this the best are the ones who are already thinking about what growth looks like. So let me give you 6 different stages you could be at your strategic planning, and I'm going to ask you where you are now. And we'll do this as an anonymous poll, okay? So it's going to be 6 options. Let me explain them to you first. So when you're in crisis mode, typically when you're talking about strategic planning, you don't have any, right? You're not thinking strategically. All you're trying to do is try to get stable, it's not even normal, but get your thinking straight. Okay, we saw this with the workplace. People working in offices had to scramble to get back to work from home, and all the IT infrastructure had to be put into place. HR had to be involved to make sure they're providing a safe work environment. People had to find places in their home to work. They had to manage kids and pets and other interruptions and so on. They weren't thinking strategically at all. And that's right. When you look back at your old strategic plan, when you can lift your head above the water, you find that it's staying out of date because it was for a previous world. Okay, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. The only thing wrong is if you stay there too long. When we get into recovery, the next 2 stages become important. So you start doing strategic planning, but your strategic planning tends to be very short term and very brittle because it's still too reactive. It's still very much based on things in the outside world as they are today. And tomorrow, and literally tomorrow, if things change, then your strategic plan then becomes stale again and it goes out of date. It's a bit better if you can be aware of short-term thinking, the short-term outcomes ahead. So you may not have done the scenario planning process, but you have a rough idea of when travel's going to open up again, when we'll be able to meet again, when restaurants and gyms are going to open. You've got a rough idea based on what you're seeing in the media, what you're hearing from other people. So your strategic plan now is being created, aware of what might come up in the near term. It's still not great though. And if you want to get to a growth phase, then as soon as you can, what you want is a strategic plan that's using a process like this scenario planning that's flexible. so that you've mapped out multiple scenarios, you've gone through a decision-making process to choose the one that you're going to follow, and you've got your plan B and plan C as backup plans. And that's really where you want to get to. And I'm hoping that today, at the end of today, you won't be there right here. Some of you might be, and we'll find out in the poll, but I'm hoping you'll be thinking, this is where I want to get to. I want to have a flexible plan for the future, not one that's brittle and could change next week if Qantas changes their rules, or if one of the states closes their borders and another one doesn't. Okay, so that's where we want to get to. Now, a few businesses and in an industry are going to say, we want to be disruptive. They're saying when everything's shaken up, there's lots of opportunities, and we want to come out of the other side of this as the disruptor to the industry. This has happened in the last 10 years or so, and I'm not going to tell you all the stories about Uber and Airbnb and so on, except to say that many of those companies started at the time of the GFC. And in some ways, it's easier to be a disruptor when everyone's being disrupted. It's harder to be a disruptor when everyone else is going along, calm and steady, and you're going to come along and shake things. Okay, so not everyone is going to go to create a disruptive plan for the future of their business and the industry, but some of them will. Okay, so let's run this. Let's run this poll. Obviously, you want to be on the high area, but I'd like you to be honest now, because what I'm asking is, where are you now with your future planning? So which of those 6 areas are you at now? Okay, so let me just start the poll. Okay, so you should have the poll in front of you. Again, it's just one of the 6 options, and just choose one of them. Oh, good, quick voting, excellent. Thank you very much for that. Helps to keep us on time. Okay, so we're at 80%. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let me stop the polling. Okay, and I'll share the results with you so you can see as well. Yeah, okay, so this is not surprising. So when I've done this, when I do this in general with businesses, what many of them say that there's very few who want to be disruptive, and that's typical here as well. There's 3% in this room. I reckon there's more opportunities than 3% who are going to be disruptors, because it's easy to disrupt now. So we've got 16%, so 1 in 6, say they're already thinking about multiple future scenarios, so they're flexible, but the biggest percentage, 57%, are saying we're aware. So we've got some idea about the future, and that's great. It's really good that you've got some planning in place already, because you're already on the road to recovery. And what I suggest you do now is go to the next level. So level up by doing the multiple scenarios, and you may still end up with the scenario that you had already. Just be aware, though, that you may have a bias to pick that scenario over the others. So try to be objective about it when you do the multiple scenarios, and then narrow it down to your A, B, and C. Okay, so anything else? So we're going to go to questions and comments about this first area. As I said, this is the one that we're going to spend most of our time on. So the next 2 we'll spend a little bit less time on, but because this was I promoted this as being about scenario planning, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of the process, but I also want you to have enough to be able to take this away and do it yourself, even if it's only at a superficial level. So any questions or comments about the scenario planning process, anything that we've done there? Rachel says, thank you for sharing the Nectar resource. Yeah, they've done a great job with that. And I see little pockets of this. So I'm always looking around to see people who are innovative at this time. I'll show you a couple of examples in the next section as well. Yes, I think the Nectar people have asked, and it's that's been answered. Yeah. So Carol Ann says, in my view, and Carol Ann, you're futurist as well, I know you do a lot of this sort of planning, how many organizations reach flexible and disruptive? So many do flexible because they want to map multiple scenarios. They tend to be the organizations which have got, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, these are the organizations that have got more of a long-term view. So they're already looking 5 to 10 years ahead. I was going to say, obviously, the bigger organizations, but that's not always true. Even some of the smaller savvy organizations with strong leadership are looking ahead. So I worked with a local council here in Perth last year, where they were doing this future planning for their local town. And when I was doing this process with them, and we were doing the briefing and having the conversation about it, and I said, how far ahead do you want to do this process? Do you want to look at 12 to 18 months or 2 to 5 years or longer? And they said, oh, no, we've already done a 5-year plan. We want you to tell us what we're going to be like in 15 to 20 years. Okay, so they were looking ahead. And this was a local council in Perth, which was just saying, we want to be, sure they'd be happy for me to say, the city of Bayswater was saying, what's the city of Bayswater going to look like in 2050 rather than in 2025? Okay, so to answer your question, Carol Ann, so some, they're more flexible. There are very few that go for disruptive, but the ones that do, and of the ones that do, only a few will succeed. But I think now that you've actually got a bigger chance of succeeding if you set yourself that really aspirational goal. Yeah, so Julia's saying some objective sources of information about how COVID-19 is likely to play out. There's lots of them around. There are the World Economic Forum is one that I would recommend, Julia. And then there's others, like The Economist is writing about this all the time. So I read broadly to get my to do my research rather than relying on one source. And also it's also useful just to look at the numbers. So the Worldometer will show you how different parts of the world are coping with COVID-19. So you know where we are now, and then you can use it as a reference point for then other people looking at what it's going to look like in the future. Penny says, have you seen a company move back and forth between the different stages? Yes, but I think what typically happens, Penny, is that, and it's this crisis recovery growth phase. So what typically happens is they've got a really clear plan, and then a crisis hits, and then they suddenly go back to going, our plan's stale now, or the plan that we had doesn't work anymore. In fact, I was dealing with an exec team of a company just yesterday who were in that position, that they had very clear plans for the future, and they'd been through this process of multiple scenarios. They picked their A, B, and C before the coronavirus, and because they were in the broadly travel, hospitality, events industry, their plans completely they just became obsolete. And I'm sure there are people here in the room, and that's true for many of us as well. The plans that we had have suddenly become obsolete, regardless of how good they were. Because sometimes you get these black swan events that you hadn't included in your plan. Carol Ann said, do you see the information about Mongolia and how they handled it? Absolutely, I did. Yeah, it's a really good article. I saw it on the ABC website, I think. Okay, let's continue. Just quickly check if there's any other questions coming in. How do we think we handle competition once we bounce back? Do you think that the industry will go to disruption? Yeah, so let's talk about customers next, because that leads into this. Yeah, okay, so some great questions and comments coming through. We'll see if we can get to them later. Let's move on to this second area. I want to look at what's happening with our customers. And I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. Mainly, I want to make a big point about this because it's essential to our future planning. It's one thing to look out into the world and say, what's COVID-19 going to do to our planet? But for our planning process, that's the first step. But we also need to look at our customers. And this guy here is the head of Google's global education. And he says when he goes out and speaks to school kids, he never asks them, what do you want to be when you grow up? He always asks them, what problem do you want to solve? And I reckon that's a really good question that we should be asking as well. So what problem are we solving for our customers? And keep in mind that the problem you're solving for your customers now will be different than 2 months ago or 3 months ago. It might be different because customers are different now. They need different things. So a really good example of this pre-COVID-19 is Netflix. So Netflix, we know it now as a streaming media service, but it wasn't always that case. When Netflix first started out, they started off as a DVD mail order service. So they didn't want to do videos, VHS tapes, because they were too heavy to send through the post. It cost them more, but they set it up with DVDs. And they were competing with the likes of Blockbuster because they set up the problem our customer has. One is they don't like returning things returning a movie after they finish watching it. And they don't like paying late fees. So they said, just pop it back in this reply paid envelope, and there's no late fees. So they set out to solve the problem that they saw in their customers' lives. But then, of course, what happened was people started getting broadband internet, and they were able to stream more at home. So Netflix didn't say, let's see if we can offer cheaper or faster DVD rentals. What they said is, let's change our business model so that customers have got streaming, they've got no content, so let's provide some content for them. And so they licensed content from other producers, and they made them available to customers on a streaming basis. So then you pay per movie. Then they found that customers kind of liked the idea of having an all-you-can-watch option, so they went to a subscription service. And then what happened was that the movie studios that were producing this material, initially they loved Netflix because here was another way they could license their material and create a revenue stream. Then later on, they realized that Netflix was a threat to them, so they stopped renewing their licenses, and Netflix was no longer allowed to show their content. So Netflix has now decided they're going to become a movie studio themselves. And so they create their own content. They've got one of the largest lots in Hollywood to create their own content, because what they're doing is following their customer. And what they're doing is saying, what problems do our customers have and how can we solve them? They're not saying, what were we doing before and what can we do better, faster, cheaper for our customers now? Okay, there's nothing wrong with that approach of saying, how do we improve? But the radical approach that Netflix took was to say, let's go back to our customers and find out what they really want. And I've been saying this to my clients for the last decade or so. I'm saying this to everybody now because this pandemic that's affected the whole world, is changing the way that customers want to interact with us. It's changing their priorities. It's changing the way they work, the way they live. And all of us should be going back to our customers and finding out what problems they have now and how we solve them. One simple example, so we're not going to workshop this, but one simple example, which I'm sure that we are all familiar with, which is why I'm choosing this one, is we've seen restaurants and cafes, pubs and clubs close down. And so what do? How do you manage that? And I'm going to show you some things, which some of them are obvious because we know this, but I want to show you that because it's familiar, that many places have decided we'll go to, initially they went to takeaway and home delivery, and that became a big part of their operations, just so they could pay their fixed costs and just keep the business running and keep a relationship with those loyal customers, even while they weren't able to provide that full service. There's restaurants and cafes, we've seen plenty of examples of that. There's even a bar in Sydney that's offering drive-through cocktails, drive-through gin and tonics. So it's not like drink and drive, it's you order it, you send a text beforehand with your cocktail, and then you drive through and they give you a little bag with it in one of those little jam jars, and then you drive away. So people are finding ways to serve their customers, but in different ways. Then, of course, we have some of the relaxation of some of the restrictions. So now we can have cafes and restaurants open again, but with appropriate physical distancing. Okay, so now people are figuring out how do you make that work. I've seen some innovative examples already. There's some restaurants which are saying that we can only have 20 people. In WA, 20 people, in other parts of the country, it's 10 people. So some of them are saying, we can only have 20. Well, pay a fixed amount and book out the whole restaurant for the night and pay a fixed fee, and everything's included. So the innovative solutions like that for customers who now have, because of the environment, they can't interact with you the same way. And there's a cafe in Germany recently, you may have seen, if you look this up online, German cafe Pool Noodles, you'll see that what they're doing is they're getting all their customers to wear these hats with pool noodles strapped on them so that they keep sufficient distance between adjacent tables. So people are finding innovative ways to do that. And then think about other industries that might encroach on yours. So in Sweden, there's a hotel chain, and hotels are down on accommodation. And what they're offering is they're offering fine dining in their hotel rooms. So you've got the physical distance, you go there with members of your household or your partner, and you have fine dining delivered from the hotel restaurant in your room, and you've got complete privacy, but you've got the distance as well, but you also have the dining experience. So these are just examples of organizations who have been really innovative about how they deal with their customers now, given that they've had to make the change. And some of these are obvious, like some of them like switch your takeaway and home delivery, because that's the only thing you can do. But look at the non-obvious things as well. It always means going back to what problem am I solving for my customers? Okay, let me check questions or comments that have come through. Okay, so we're blue. So Deborah says we're blue sky planning, but we're factoring both the different scenarios, but COVID forever. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So COVID forever. I've heard that term before as well. The idea that it's going to become endemic in our community, and the additional layer of different scenarios relating to economic. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, great, Deborah. Haley says advice for a potential disruptor in a brittle environment. How do you help people to see beyond where they're stuck? Yeah, and I think I know the environment you're talking about, Haley, because we've had a couple of conversations around this. There's an excellent book by Chip and Dan Heath. It's called Switch, How to Deal with Change. And one of the things they say with they have these 9 principles for making change happen. And one of them is to find positive examples. So if you can find positive examples of people who are doing well, then and share them with the people that you're working with, it actually shows them what they could achieve. And they don't even have to be examples from your industry, which I know is healthcare. They could be from other industries as well. And but the healthcare one might be the easiest one for you to sell. The idea that we shouldn't be brittle anymore. We should be looking beyond brittle on the path to recovery. Okay, so there's a few questions about Zoom and how I'm using Zoom with projecting my PowerPoint slides and so on. It is Zoom webinar, and I'm using ManyCam, which lets me show my slides kind of projected on my video window. So for people who want to know the technical details of that. Okay, so let's look at this third area. This third area, in some ways, is the most important, even though we think that the pandemic is the most dramatic thing that's happened to us. The way that we respond to it is just as important. And I want to share with you this idea around your mindset. And I want to give you a very specific activity, which we'll do, and I'll also run a poll on this afterwards. And it's based on this book by Howard Gardner. So this is Howard Gardner of the multiple intelligences fame. So, you know, he talked about multiple intelligences, and he also wrote this book, 5 Minds for the Future. And he's talking about 5 different mindsets that we need for the future. And so this applies both to individuals and to teams. So when I do this with teams, we do this and we ask people like what everyone in the room, in the team, you rank yourself in each of these 5 mindsets, and then we look at what are the strengths in the team, what are the weaknesses, who are the people who've got certain strengths that you might be the go-to person for a particular area, and who are the people with weaknesses who want to build up that area. But it applies equally to individuals. So even though we call these 5 minds, and you may think you only have 1 brain and 1 mind, ideally you want to have some element of all 5 of these. Okay, so let me share with you what the 5 minds for the future are that Howard Gardner talks about in his book. And you can go to the book and read it, but this will be a good overview for you. The first one is this disciplined mind. I don't like the word disciplined because it has the connotations of being determined and hardworking and focused and so on. That's not what he means here. This is the mind that has learned a discipline, that you've learned a skill, whatever your technical skill is in your area of expertise. It could be a hard skill, a soft skill, but in your area of expertise. So you've got discipline, you've got a discipline behind you, and and a disciplined mind continues to keep learning in that discipline. So just because you left school or you left university and you've got the letters after your name, the certificate on the wall, doesn't mean that you stop learning. You keep learning in that area of discipline. Okay, so that's the first one. And the second one is the connector's mind. So Gardner calls it the synthesizing mind, the person who can look at things from industry A or business A and business B, combines them together and says, oh, here's a new idea that we hadn't thought about. So I hope that by me showing you some examples of what cafes and restaurants have done to be creative, that you can kind of go, oh, I can synthesize that. I can take that idea from what a cafe did. Here's how it works in the events industry, and I can make that work. Okay, so that's what the synthesizing mind does. It's the connector or the linker, the sense maker. The third one is the one who is creative, who comes up with ideas almost out of nowhere. Of course, ideas don't come out of nowhere, they come out of the environment, but she's the person that goes, oh, I reckon we could do this. And everyone else goes, fantastic. And sometimes they go, well, duh, now we can do it, but I didn't think of that before. So that's the person who's creative. Okay, so those are the first three. The next one is the interpersonal mind or the respectful mind. So this is thinking about other people that you're engaging with. So this is about collaboration, teamwork, leadership, or other people outside. So this is think about customers, doing customer empathy mapping, customer journey mapping, those sort of things. And the last one is the more global mind, the ethical mind that's thinking about the world. What's this mean for our future? What's this mean for our grandchildren's grandchildren, and so on? Okay, so now all of us have some elements of each of those five minds. It's just a question of how much we have, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses. So for me, I know my weakness, if I was to say, to look at all five of them, and you said, which is your biggest weakness? I'd say it's a creative mind, getting ideas out of nowhere. I'm pretty good at, I'd like to think that I'm quite good at the respectful and ethical mind. As a futurist, I kind of have to think big picture. So I'm always thinking about what this means for the world, what this means for the future. I'm pretty good at the synthesizing, and as an active learner, I'm always looking at getting better at my discipline and my skills, my expertise. But the creative mind, I'm just amazed at people who can do that. Maybe people who can do that are amazed at some of the others. Okay, so how was I asking you to think about your workplace? And if you work by yourself, then maybe you want to apply this to yourself. And actually, even if you've got a team, it's okay if you want to apply this just to yourself. So which minds do you need most in your workplace? So of those five, let's run the poll here. Which is the one that you think would be most valuable in your workplace? And if you don't want to, if you don't care about your workplace, and you just want to ask about your answer this for yourself, feel free to do that. This poll is slightly different because you can actually tick more than one box, which is why the question is minds plural. Okay, so which are the things that you think are the weaknesses in your workplace? Because that will spur you on, especially if you're a leader, and I know there are a lot of leaders here today, that'll spur you on to bring that skill and that expertise in, or at least develop that as part of the active learning in your learning and development program. Okay, we're up to 70%. So we're almost at my cutoff. Oh, here we go, 80%. So 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thanks everyone. There's a mix, so let me share the results. Yeah, okay, so the one that comes up the most is 61% creative mind. Interesting. And the synthesizing mind at 40%. And the others about, oh, disciplined about 30, respectful 30, yeah, ethical 20%. Yeah, okay, so big picture thinking. So it's interesting, and I've seen no particular pattern whenever I've run this exercise, either in person or on these online presentations. There hasn't been a pattern. There's always been a mix. Obviously, the numbers aren't going to add up to 100 because there's a you can answer more than once. But I reckon for you individually and for you as a leader, for your team, this is really important. And if you want one action to take away at the end of this presentation, one more, apart from the scenario planning, because now we're talking about how do you actually put this into action, and use this as a quick self-assessment of the things that you want to build up these capabilities and competencies in your team. Okay, let me stop those results, and we'll just have a look at it if there's any questions here for our last section. Okay, so Julia says, I didn't quite catch the authors of the Switch book you were talking about. The two brothers, Chip and Dan Heath, H-E-A-T-H. Let me just type it in for everyone else. Chip and Dan Heath. They've written the book Switch, and also another excellent book called Decisive, which is all about decision making. And before we finish up, I'll share with you one of the ideas from that book. Decisive. Okay, I see people have answered some questions for other people, which is good. Thank you very much for doing that. John says planning is better in, this was earlier, John said planning is better in groups. How do you select the right people to involve? Actually, this exercise here will help you do exactly that. What you'd like to have is ideally a group of people who are covering all of those five minds, so that you're not only going to just the narrow focus about technical area of expertise. You go broader, you're thinking about the future, you're thinking about people, and all of that comes into it. Okay, and other people are sharing some. Oh, okay, some book summaries of Switch and so on. Great, thank you for that. Thank you everyone for sharing. This is why I like people responding to everyone, rather than asking questions just to me, because there's a lot of intelligence in the room as well, and it's great to see other people answering those questions. So thanks for doing that. Okay, so just before we finish up, a last bit. So we talked about this. We talked about dealing with the world, so doing the scenario planning. We talked about engaging with our customers, and we talked about your 5 minds for the future. If you are interested in engaging with me, so have a look at my website, gihanperera.com. I'm talking about a lot of things now to help people get ready for what our future looks like. So what's our future going to look like post-pandemic? COVID-19 has accelerated digital transformation for us, and that's a good thing. Maybe not the way we want it to happen, but it's a really good thing. So how do we now integrate high tech and high touch, particularly in the workplace, given that we've had this big work from home experiment and organizations have had to scramble to create this ability for some people to work from home, and we'll never go back to the idea that everyone's going to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday in an office. The research has already shown that people want that flexibility, and also opens up so many other possibilities, like tapping into lost talent, like professional women who've taken time off to go on maternity leave. They want to come back to work, but they don't want to traipse into the office every day. But you can tap into their skills and their tremendous expertise by bringing them in as working from home part-time, because we've now got that capability. So that sort of thing is now a real possibility, and organizations are thinking about that as they're thinking about what customers are going to be like post-pandemic. And you've seen a little glimpse of that today, but it's true for everyone. Our customers are going to be different. And even in industries that haven't been affected as much, if their customers have been affected, customers are different. So I like to finish my presentations with this quotation, and this is attributed to a number of people, but I think the earliest one I could find was this, Benjamin Brewster in the late 19th century. He said, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So if you've got some good ideas out of today, please take them away and put them into practice, because only when you do will you actually find out how useful they are and what you need to do to tweak them to make them work for you. So please, please, please take your notes, watch the recording, and then put the ideas into practice. Thanks everyone for coming along. If you want to connect with me after the presentation, all my details are on the website. I look forward to engaging with you again. Thank you for coming along. Thank you for taking part, and stay safe, stay well, stay healthy. Bye for now.